All right, so welcome everyone to our April 2024 community call on ORCID and funders. Today's call is hosted by the ORCID US community and ORCID CA. Next slide. We'll start today's session with some introductions. The first three people you see are our ORCID US community staff. Sheila Rabin is the Senior Strategist for Research and Infrastructure Programs. Paolo Guhilde is the Strategist for the ORCID US community. And I'm Kayla Ramhit, the Program Assistant for the ORCID US community. And we work with ORCID Consortium members in the United States. Next slide. Thank you. So today's session is also going to be hosted by our colleagues from the ORCID Consortium in Canada, whom you see pictured here, John Aspler, manager of the Canadian Persistent Identifier Community, and Ursula Carmichael, Canadian Persistent Identifier Community Officer. And the two of them work with our ORCID Consortium members in Canada. So for today's call, we'll start with an overview of ORCID, discussing ORCID interoperability and the role stakeholders can play in the research ecosystem. So we'll also discuss ORCID and funding workflows and how ORCID can assist with that process. So we will also be discussing how some platforms that have built-in ORCID API integrations. And after this brief overview, we will have a panel discussion about ORCID and funders. We're excited to hear from our speakers today. So from the United States, we welcome our speakers from Bright Focus Foundation and the Research Corporation for Science Advancement from the US. And then from Canada, we are welcoming our speakers from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council. All our panelists will talk about ORCID at their organizations. And then we'll have time at the end for a Q&A. And with that, I will pass it on to Sheila to begin our overview.
Great, thanks, Kayla. Okay, so before we get into our panel discussion, we just want to set the stage with some overview information about ORCID and funding, how ORCID can fit into funding workflows, so that we're all starting with kind of a shared understanding of how ORCID and funding go together. So looking at the research ecosystem as a whole, this graphic that we have on the slide here kind of illustrates how ORCID can fit into the entire research landscape or ecosystem. So you have the researcher at the center with their ORCID ID and their ORCID record, and then ideally that researcher's employer, for example, will connect with their ORCID record, get information from that researcher's ORCID record, and add information to the ORCID record. And same thing with any publishers and also any funders that researchers are working with. And so ORCID and the ORCID record kind of start to serve as this central hub for keeping track of information about researchers and the different organizations that they're working with. So while the entire ecosystem is important, today we're just going to be focusing on this piece where funders come into the picture. And so the overview of how ORCID can work in funding workflows starts with funding organizations getting researchers' ORCID IDs, reading data from researchers' ORCID records, and writing data to researchers' ORCID records. So let's take a quick look at each of those aspects. So the starting point for funders and really any organization that wants to work with researchers and use ORCID to help with that process is to get your researchers' ORCID IDs. The best way to do that is to use the ORCID API or Application Programming Interface. And through that, there's an ORCID authentication process. We call it OAuth. And that's essentially the process that a researcher goes through to connect their ORCID ID to an organization, like a funding organization or to a software system, for example. So the screenshots on this slide are just an example from a software system called Proposal Central, which a lot of funders use. And researchers go to these systems to apply for funding, for example. So the screenshot on the left shows how researchers can log into a system using their ORCID record, which kind of saves time. And then once logged in, there's an option to create or connect your ORCID ID. And so researchers can do that. They can connect their ORCID ID with their Proposal Central profile. This is just one example, but getting that ORCID ID is the first step. And that can come into play when a researcher is logging into a system or getting ready to apply for funding, for example. So when they click on that create or connect your ORCID little button, the researcher would sign into their ORCID record, and then or if they don't already have an ORCID ID, they would register for one right then and there. So that's what this screen is showing. That OAuth process, or that authorization process, starts with the researcher signing into ORCID or creating an ORCID account if they don't already have one. And then a little screen pops up asking for the researcher to authorize permission to get their ORCID ID. And so that's how that authorization process works. From there, once you have a researcher's ORCID ID, you can read data from that person's ORCID record. So any information that a researcher might already have filled out in their ORCID profile can be pulled into a local system, for example, again, using the ORCID API. So this is just an example from my ORCID record. I have a lot of works information filled out. And so all of this can be transferred over to any kind of software system as long as the ORCID API is being used there. So that can happen at any time from the funding organization deciding to pull data out of a researcher's ORCID record. A way that this can be implemented that is really helpful for both researchers and funders is to allow researchers to actually populate their profile or populate their funding application with data from their ORCID record. So in this example, again, from Proposal Central, there's an option to update their professional profile from ORCID. So when that option is used, basically they click a button and all their information from their ORCID record is showing up in their Proposal Central profile. So again, that saves time, eliminates that administrative burden of having to sit there and fill out forms over and over again. And then that data can go on to populate applications or progress reports, for example. And so that's the aspect of kind of pulling data out of an ORCID record and using that in your workflows. And then the third aspect is writing data to ORCID records. And so funders that are ORCID members can use the ORCID member API to actually add information to researchers' ORCID records. So for funders, that's typically adding funding information. So information about grants and awards that your researchers have received from you, and also reviewer activity. So if you have researchers that are doing peer review and reviewing grants, they can get recognized for that peer review activity too. The information or the image that you're seeing on the slide here is just an example showing a funding information that was written to somebody's ORCID record by the American Heart Association. And so that's one of the really great things about ORCID, is that when your organization is a member of ORCID, you can assert this kind of information to confirm, like, yes, this researcher did receive this grant from American Heart Association, and everyone who looks at that knows it's true because the source of the information here is American Heart Association. So we can trust that this person did, in fact, get this grant. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Paolo to briefly talk to us about some existing software systems that have this kind of ORCID API functionality built in.
Thank you, Sheila. If you could, next slide, please. Great, thank you. So as Sheila mentioned, so there are some member API that you can use to basically use in your vendor systems that already have ORCID functionality built into them. One of them is Proposal Central, and Proposal Central is a certified service provider of ORCID. And with this, you can read the names, employment, education qualifications, funding, works, keywords, and country of the ORCID user. And of course, it can also write funding and peer review activity to ORCID. Other systems as well, such as Smart Simple, are also able to do those kind of functionality. So you can see what's available here and what it can read and what data it can grab from ORCID. And again, it will also write funding to ORCID as well. And the other thing is the Symplectic Grant Tracker. So as far as we know, all of these systems are able to read works from ORCID, and similar to Grant Tracker as well, it can read works from ORCID, and it could also write funding to ORCID. It's always a good thing for you all to check if you're interested in any of these systems, to check with the vendor to make sure that you know what's available, what kind of ORCID functionality are available that you can use. So it's always a good way to check on that. And you can also check our common systems for ORCID integration list, and you'll be able to look at more details about these systems as well as other systems. Next slide, please. So aside from vendor systems, another way that you can do an integration is a custom integration. And this is one of the best way to actually integrate with ORCID, as you'll be able to customize your integration with ORCID, so the way you would like it to be, and using the member API. And in general, the member API is really, it mitigates confusion caused by name ambiguity. So that's really a big part of ORCID. And a big part of that also is to streamline information gathering. So the data that you're trying to grab from ORCID records, and you can also assert trustworthy and accurate information. So you're sending that data like what Sheila had kind of talked about when organizations are pushing data to ORCID. And ultimately, a big part of this is really saving time and reduce administrative burden. So that's not, that includes your organization, saving you time and making sure that you're working on those kind of workflows and processes. And at the same time, it also saves a lot of the time of your researchers. And that's really a big part of the member API and how ORCID works in the integration. And we always recommend to take a look at the custom integration guide, and that will help you look at the different steps and considerations on what you need to do when it comes to doing a customized integration. Next slide, please. And finally, another system, which is a built-in tool in the affiliation, in the member portal, is the affiliation manager. So the affiliation manager, it basically you're able to assert or push affiliation data to ORCID, and that includes your education, employment, qualifications, invited position, distinction, membership, and service. So I want to highlight here distinction because you can actually use that particular affiliation to push, say, awards. So for example, you're handing out awards to your researchers, or you're handing out awards to students. So that's a good way to kind of provide a little bit more of data and a little bit more of information that this person received a particular award from your organization. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation with, say, a funding award, but say if you're sending out, say, Researcher of the Year, that's a good way to use distinction, or a student paper, for example. So a best student paper is a good way to kind of do that. Affiliation Manager does requires one ORCID member API key to enable it. As an ORCID member, you have access to 5 ORCID API keys, so you can use one of that to activate your Affiliation Manager. And again, this is available through ORCID's member portal. And there's also a guide that you can use to take a look at more in details on what Affiliation Manager can do. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to John so we can go into our discussion.
Thank you so much, Paolo. So yes, I'd like to welcome again our panelists. Diane Bovenkamp is the VP of Scientific Affairs and Chief Scientist at Bright Focus Foundation. Andrew Feig is the Senior Program Director at the Research Corporation for Science Advancement. Both are our US panelists. And then from Canada, we have Ariane Legendre, Deputy Director, Data Strategy and Analytics at SSHRC, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, and Michael Lamb, who is the Chief Data Officer at NSERC, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. So I'm going to ask everyone to turn on, all of our panelists, I should say, to turn on their cameras. And yes, we'll stop screen sharing so that folks can be part of the discussion. And what we're basically going to be doing is that we have 4 broad, big questions. I'm going to be posing each of them to one person first, and then time willing, we'll move along to the rest of the speakers where possible. So we're going to start with Ariane from SHIRP. And the first question is, why did your organization decide to use ORCID or become an ORCID member in the first place?
Hi, thanks. Well, for all the reason that was already mentioned, probably, and I'll go into the more specific ones. Even though it took us a long time, what seemed like it took us a long time to join ORCID, for some of us it was an easy sell, but for the organization sometimes it's not always an easy sell. There's a culture change that we had to address, but I think we really saw the most fundamental benefit of ORCID was the linkages between data and really using that in advantages to reduce burden on the researcher, but also increase our data quality. So as many of you, I assume, our agency has several legacy systems that don't always talk to each other. So we saw this as really a way to improve data quality, but really also um, link data in a way that would reduce burden, but also to help us measure some policies that we have in place that we've really struggled measuring. And just to name a few, like open science is not one that we have that's easy to measure on our end. And so, yeah, so that's, I think in a nutshell, that's why we wanted to do it. It took us a long time to join and lots of discussion. But, just to kind of give a perspective to everyone, we started a discussion way before COVID. And then when COVID hits, obviously a lot of reprioritizing that happened, and we kind of had to put that on hold. But now we're here and we're happy, and we're very happy to kind of move forward and see where that will take us. So.
Thank you, Ariane. I'll move the question to Diane. Same question.
Are you unmuted here? Yeah, I mean, we're based in the U.S., but we actually fund internationally. We funded we're just ending our 50th anniversary. We've funded almost $300 million to 6,300 scientists in 25 countries, and so. I think that having a persistent identifier is really important. I think the main sell is we have about 80% of our grantees now are early career investigators, especially if they're postdocs. They move away and you don't have their contact information. I think ORCID really is a good way to try and keep track of that follow-on funding, their progression in their career, and just having the, giving reports on impact of funding to the public, affected families, donors, and the board.
Thank you.
Can I add one point, John? Sorry, I forgot.
Of course. No, please go ahead.
Yeah. And that's an important, you made me think of that, Diane, when you were saying, but one other thing that was really important for us to, beyond what the obvious that I just mentioned, was, the community, that's where we're at. So in order to meet where the community is, also, there's a lot of researchers that are using this. We need to meet them there also as funders. And actually in Canada, we had a group of researchers that petitioned that we switched the what we were using to move to ORCID. And, so that really kind of was a awakening moment, I think, for a lot of people to say, oh, wow, they really want us. So that was kind of an important point also that happened. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that I think meeting the community where they are is really important in the process too.
Thanks, Ariane. Same question to Michael.
Thanks, John. So a lot of it's been said already. And I'll just note for everyone here, Ariane and I, our two funding agencies work very closely together. So interoperability becomes really important, and not just within the agencies, but with our partnering and other funding agencies across Canada. So this interoperability is really important. So ORCID provides that means to do it with a persistent identifier. Ariane mentioned some of the data linkages. Impact measurement is one of the things that she mentioned that we struggle with. So linkages with other persistent identifiers such as RORs, DOIs, and publications, that gives us much more intelligence that we can work with when informing program development. So we're just starting our journey, which is a good and bad thing. And I'll just mention the good thing is that we can learn from all of you that have integrated, that have been using ORCID for a long time, and to really understand what are the best use cases. So maybe holding the puck, I'll use a Canadian, just a bit longer before shooting, maybe has been a really good thing for us.
Thanks so much, Michael. We are going to move to the next question, but Andrew, you are the first person to answer this. And if you have anything you want to add, please feel free to do it then. The next question is, how are you currently using ORCID, or how do you want to use it in the future?
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share a slide of our workflow, if that's okay. Let me just get it up and put it in. Is it showing up properly? Yep. Okay. So I joined RCSA about just shy of 5 years ago, but we are a legacy funding agency where we've been around for 115 years. So we have information systems that stretch back many, many years. And part of some of the transitions I brought in as I joined RCSA was a revamping of our grant management software and the decision to shift to symplectic systems. So we developed a system called PRISM, Proposal Review and Information System Manager. It's a grant tracker implementation. It went live about 15 months ago. And this provides an overview of how we're using ORCID. We started collecting ORCID informally about 3 years ago, but we're not a member at that time when we're using it on a voluntary basis. So we use it at proposal submission. It is now a required element in our proposals. We use it in CV generation. We use the grant tracker, the Symplectics API to link publication history and allow PIs to upload that. We'll come back to some issues that we've had with that. We capture all of the data there in BibTeX format, and this allows for some special implementations that we have not yet used, such as review blinding. We use it in proposal review. This gives us one-click access to DOIs through the system. So a reviewer who wishes to open up a paper during review can do that. And it provides the configurable output. So if we want to, for instance, blind the journal, we can show just the DOI. If we want to blind authors, we can redact that information in the process of generating the review paperwork. We are starting the process of pushing out the writing of our grants to ORCID. This is about to go live in the next week or two. This required Symplectic to update their system, which happened in late January, early February, and now allows us to push for greater visibility of our awards. But the real reason that we adopted this actually has to do with outcomes assessment and post-award reporting. So we collect, depending on our grants, annual and terminal reports. Those last one to 3 years, depending on the term of the grant. But we actually monitor outputs 10 and 15 years beyond the life cycle of our grants to look at changes in researcher productivity, changes in collaboration behavior, and changes in the scientific domains in which our stakeholders are working. So we do this using APIs actually with dimensions, because a large percentage of the ORCID stakeholder community has their records locked down for privacy purposes. And so this does not allow us to do effective monitoring in ORCID directly, but it does require us to have the ORCID ID to do effective identification of the user identifier in dimensions. This then allows us to use the dimensions API to track annually, and we get far better data from the output there. Let me stop there, and then we can come back to any of this in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Andrew. I'm sure. I'm sure we'll also cover it in some of the other questions, but yeah, certainly we'll come back to it in the Q&A. So same question. How are you using it, or do you want to use it? And I'll put this to Ariane.
Yeah, that's we have I guess large ambition, but there hasn't been implemented at SSHRC or NSERC right now. We are looking at kind of different use cases and then stages. The first one would be just to get kind of the ORCID ID and very simplistic information about the applicants in our system, so that they don't have to retype what organization they're from, where was their last degree, that kind of stuff. And because as funders, we are exploring different type of CV information that moves away from the list of publication and all of this, but really more in the narrative. We're looking at how we're going to integrate some of the information in ORCID and with that in need also. So we're kind of really interested in that conversation also. But right now, the idea is that we would just put it in as to get that kind of like basic person related information.
Thanks, Ariane. And if you have just a quick last thought on this question, I'll move it to you, Diane.
Yeah, well, I mean, right, we're just beginning. We're still just getting permission because we just joined less than a year ago. But I know in the future, I would love to try and integrate RORs and DOIs with with this as well, to try and look at impact. So I think, yeah, there's so much we can do with this, and I'm just learning.
Thank you so much. All right, so we'll move on to our third question, which we'll be starting with you, Diane, which is your organization considering or implementing policies related to ORCID?
Yeah, so I mean, we have, just like Andrew was saying, we've made it mandatory that people give enter at least their ORCID ID for the past number of years. But we just became a Lyrasis US ORCID member just recently because so I think that it'll be very important for us, as all the other members said, is to keep track of the scientists. 80% are early career, and it's we do have follow-up surveys, but probably only about 25% of scientists actually fill them out, and probably it's because they've moved from institutions. So I'm hoping that ORCID can help us with that. And I think that the difficult part will also be to contact back to historical grantees. Many of them, we go back 50 years, not quite 115 years. There wouldn't be email addresses for some of them, but yeah, so I think that it would be better to track grantees as they move from institution to institution. And I think that it would the flip side of it is, you know, of the what can it do for us? We want what can it do for our applicants? So we want to really reduce administrative burden. And this was one of the easiest ways for us to do that. If they just click and can fill in all the info rather than for not just applications, but for progress reports as well. So I think that'll be very important too. And the reviewers, I just found out, I didn't realize that we could give credit to our scientific review committee reviewers for their service. So I think that'll be really important, right? And if there are any other organizations out there like us that rebranded in 2013, we're called Bright Focus now, but we used to be called AHAF, American Health Assistance Foundation. So there's a lot of people out there who don't know who we are. So if we can push out the info, also helpful for those people to know. A lot of scientists probably don't know that they were actually Bright Focus grantees. So I'm sure everybody else has some other information that they'd like to talk about for their particular programs as well.
Thank you, Diane. Yes, over to Michael. Are you considering or implementing policies related to ORCID?
We're exploring. Maybe I'll highlight one specific or two specific use cases. The first one is about identity verification. So in Canada, we have a focus on research security, and I'm sure in the US there are activities associated with research security. So, and this is to prevent our researchers from working with bad actors. And thus there's a verification step that needs to happen when there's a proposal in an area of sensitive research. And you can think about things like telecommunications and military applications. So we want to provide enough information for the folks who are vetting these applications to fully understand if what the applicants putting in the proposal are true, and thus if there's something like a verified ORCID ID, and that's associated with the application, that makes it much easier, not just from the perspective of that particular applicant, but also following the breadcrumbs to their collaborators and associated institutions that that person has worked for or worked with in the past.
Can I just jump on that too? I mean, coming in from being in the US perspective, I think that's really great, Michael. I know in the US we have something like that's called an OFAC list. I'm sure that in Canada you have the same, where you can't fund certain institutions and people internationally. And this is great. Thank you for making, reminding us of that. It's an extra tool that us and our finance department can use to try and track down and make sure that we can legally give money to these institutions and people at those institutions.
It's a burden, and any way we can reduce that burden is frankly more funding that we can give our researchers, and reduces the administrative part of it as well, save some time.
All right, and with that, we have to jump to the next question. So I will be starting with Michael and then on to Andrew, which is a big one. What are the barriers that you have encountered? How did you overcome them, if you have overcome them? And or what kind of support would be needed in order to include ORCID effectively in your funding workflows?
So as Ariane's mentioned, it's taking more than 5 years for NSERC and SSHRC to join the ORCID party, and we're starting our integrations. The biggest challenge for us, being in Canada, is the question about data sovereignty and data residency. So as you folks know, in the US, there's something called the Patriot Act. And what that says is that US federal agencies such as NSA, CIA, so on and so forth, may access data that's located in the US without personal consent. So that's a problem for us in Canada, because we don't have, ORCID does not store or doesn't have servers in Canada. So what that means is that adoption of ORCID is it can't be mandatory. So Andrew mentioned that there was a mandatory requirement to use ORCID. And that's great in the US, we're envious, but in our case, we have to use the carrot approach instead of the stick. So the biggest challenge is adoption. How do we get our researchers, the applicants to adopt, to put their information in ORCID in a voluntary way, make it the easiest path for them. And this, what's challenge has brought is that we have to maintain two parallel paths if we adopt ORCID. We have to have a reasonable path for our applicants to enter their information that is not ORCID. So what this means now, given that we're on board, that we have to make it the easiest way and the most convenient way, and to work with our partnering organizations, our stakeholders to get the word out, essentially. So unless and how if there are ways that we can repatriate or have the Canadian data within Canada, I see that as a path that's not necessarily practical, but if there's a better way to do it, I'm all ears.
Thank you, Michael. And that is a perfect then transition to Andrew, who's in a very different situation to the folks at NSERC and SSHRC and the Tri-Agency. So for you, what are some of the biggest barriers you've encountered or overcome, and what kind of support would be needed to include ORCID more effectively than you already do, perhaps, in your current workflows?
Well, let me riff on Michael's answer for just a second. We do have applicants from Canada. So we fund in US and Canada. And what many of our Canadian applicants do is they actually give us their ORCID number, but then don't populate anything in ORCID. So it's basically a serial number and it's blank. That is sufficient for us in many ways because we can then use that to track them through various job employments in other ways. So so they don't have to have the ORCID record publicly available. And that locks down some of the data. That actually leads to one of our larger issues with implementation, and that is that there is a lot of user training still required as we shifted to its implementation. A lot of users have their ORCID, don't even recognize that their ORCID privacy settings are set so tightly that nothing communicates outside of ORCID. And so they write to us frustrated that they can't upload their papers because their privacy settings are set to, even though they've made the handshake, we can't see them. And so we actually have to spend a fair amount of time with our users informing them about ORCID settings in their own accounts. So if there were a FAQ page that we could point them to that would preclude that, we would appreciate that, because we probably spend 10 or 15 minutes per person having to, who comes up with this, having to sort of, we have form letters to send them, but once again, we have to handhold them through that process of getting them their accounts to the level that they want to share. Other hurdles, working with BibTeX was a little challenging for Symplectic at times. The standard formats, for instance, are hardwired into their system, so they had to rewrite some reference formats to do things like de-identification or to include a DOI in the references, but they now have scripts to do that kind of thing. So they're working with the vendors in terms of how to get what you need from the API, even once you've collected it. It just takes time as you implement a system.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Andrew, as well. And so with maybe just any quick final thoughts here, Ariane, did you have anything you wanted to add to this question?
No, I think, if we're talking about some of the barriers, that is the question we're still on, right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, challenges, barriers, exactly.
Yeah, I think for us too, it was the resources. Like I think we can't undermine the amount of resources that it takes. Like even though it will bring efficiencies, I think in the end, like for some of our old systems, it is quite a bit of a change to change that, but also the culture change. So some of, and especially when we're working with Dora and with moving away from the publication, which is kind of what we ran into is, well, how does ORCID fit with a more narrative type of CV, right? And that was so a big challenge we just had recently that we, so I think that can be undermined in the whole environment, is that there are changes and as much as we have to evolve and to ORCID will also have to continue to evolve to the environment changing, right? So
And if I could just quickly add to what Michael said about in Canada, I mean, maybe the solution could be that ORCID could have databases in each scientist country. I don't know, that might be complicated, but you were adding in the GDPR, right? In Europe, there's a lot of people who opt out of it as well. It's not just Canada, right? Because we're funding all around the world. So we can't necessarily make it mandatory. People have to opt in. Like make it mandatory that they give us an ORCID number. So again, I think going to what Andrew said, the education about what it can do for them as well as for us. I know it's mandatory in NIH, but maybe there could be some way that we can have all of our funding agencies get together, including the NIH, that ORCID is mandatory, and bring all of our grantees and together and just to educate them about this. So that could help to reduce the barrier of just getting people to sign on and educate them on how to use it.
Thank you so much, Diane. So I've heard a number of sort of interesting themes pop up. Of course, there's this, research data security question and some of the specifics of how data is managed across borders and in Canada specifically. I've also heard a number of challenges around the adoption of ORCID by scholars. We have lots of different stakeholders involved. We have institutions, we have individual researchers, we have government agencies, universities, independent nonprofit funders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it is interesting to hear that. And I guess with those things in mind, and any of the other questions you've answered, the last panel question I'll ask, and this can be for all of you, any of you, before we get to the Q&A section, is having engaged with each other, what's a main takeaway, or what's something you're going to be thinking about going forward? Anywhere you want to grow or build the discussion before we move to Q&A.
I think for me, if I could step in here, I think I like what Michael was saying earlier. Maybe let's try and do some more carrots instead of sticks. Because it's not just for the time that we're funding them. Right now, it's really hard to get in contact with a researcher afterwards, but they don't understand that for us, I mean, once they're a grantee, they're with us, they're connected with us for life, and we'll try and support them in non-monetary ways too. So it's in their best interest to still be connected with that funder, because we're vested in their success. So I think maybe putting things like that, it's to your best interest to join, give us permission to stay connected with you. Maybe some more carrots.
That's certainly where we're at as well. This is all about survey reduction. We don't want them having to do lots of reporting to us on the awards. And if we have their ORCID, we can we can follow them essentially forever. And that means that we're not sending them SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics surveys 5 years later.
Well, that's I'm laughing because that's exactly what we do. We used to use SurveyMonkey, but now we're using Moxco, which is essentially the same thing. But having some use cases like this more downstream that have been effective and having that as a template for other jurisdictions who jump on board, so that they could really do that workflow adoption almost right away. So Ariane and I had a really good conversation with the Irish Research Council, who've been doing this for a long time, probably over 10 years. And I would say that we're really envious of that. Because there's a need in the UK and in Ireland, because their funding is based on the research outcomes, and so so researchers have to put that information in, and thus having ORCID paves the way to reducing that burden that researchers have to do, and then the funders have that really rich information at the end. So I'd like to see ORCID maybe have a look at that ecosystem, not just ORCID IDs, but linking all those other persistent identifiers.
Everything
Towards your,
you just said, I agree.
yeah, towards your end, Michael, you know, one of the major outcomes that we have for one of our programs is research collaboration. And with their identifiers, we actually can identify when people start publishing with one another. And so because we pull once a year the DOIs of every paper that every one of our participants has funded, we can then identify when two people who met at one of our events starts co-publishing together. And so we have an extensive analysis that looks at network formation of after our events. And so that's impossible without having these kinds of identifiers.
Yeah. And I'll say that I think every funding organization wants that, wants to see the outcomes of what they're funding, but it takes an analyst. It's a monumental task for an analyst. Imagine trying to link all the publication data, all the funding data all together. It's non-trivial. So making it easier, making those connections is really helpful.
So we need an AI app layered on top of ORCID. Just sift through all of that data.
All right. Well, on that note, we're going to move it over to the last part of this panel, which is a Q&A. My colleague Ursula will be managing that. But for questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your hand. Ursula will handle the rest. And thanks as well to our panelists who will keep answering questions here.
Great. Thank you, John. And thank you to our panelists for the great insights you've provided during the panel discussion. So as John said, we'll now be proceeding to the Q&A portion of today's community call. I just posted the Q&A instructions in the chat, and I'll go ahead and review them very quickly now. So you can go ahead and post any questions you have in the chat, and I will read out the questions in the order I receive them. You can also raise your hand during this Q&A session, and I will call on you to unmute. A quick reminder to please address your questions to specific panelists, staff, or if it is a discussion question for all to consider. We hope to answer as many questions as possible today, but our apologies if we don't have time to address all of them. I think we have about 10-ish minutes left in the call. So if you have any follow-up questions, please reach out to myself and John at ORCIDCA at crcan.ca, or Sheila, Paulo, and Kayla at ORCIDUS at lyrasis.org. All right, so I can see if we have any questions in the chat, or if we have any hands raised. I see Gilda, you have your hand raised, so you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
I was typing it, but it's a question for Diane. What would you suggest as a first step to bring DORA and ORCID together? The first one.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear it. To bring ORCID and what together?
Okay, I'll post it on the, yeah. I just posted it.
Oh, DORA and ORCID together. Ooh, I'm not using Dora. I think it was Ariadne who was using Dora. Maybe you can answer that question.
Yeah. So we've signed on to Dora, both Shirk and NSERC. And that's one of the reasons why we're also moving away from the publication list. And we're exploring a narrative CV to really measure the impact that researchers have, not just based on publication, but on everything out there that they've done. So this is one way we've done this, but we do see a place to integrate ORCID with this. And it also goes to what's being shared with the reviewers, right? Like, we're not going to share the ORCID number so that the reviewers will go see, most likely. So we haven't implemented yet, but my thoughts are, and very preliminary, is that ORCID number is really for them to push information and for us to push information, but not for the reviewers to see that unless there's a use for it. But right now, I don't see that very specifically. I don't know if that answers your question.
So you're saying that it's not good for a narrative CV, but potentially it can be as a complement to the narrative CV.
Well, I think, I think they complement each other very nicely. And I'm not saying it's not good. It's just that we still need some very specific information from them that are, I would say, like CV, not necessarily as what is this, what are you bringing to, the project, and why are you the best person to do this project kind of thing. But, like the regular, like, where do you work? What's your institution? Where did you get your degree? And that kind of stuff. We can push that over from ORCID very easily. And that doesn't go against Dora at all. It's when we start having all the publication, I think and that's where we're starting to explore different ways.
If I could jump in, I think that let's face it, the research community is it's going to take a monumental shift to move from publications altogether in terms of CV records. But I don't think that's the intent of Dora either. That's a rich set of information, but it'll be used in different ways. And so that's maybe the opportunity for ORCID is to be able to capture that different type. What are we looking for that's a little bit different? We don't want the hard metric. What's your index number? That's sort of what's your H index. It's H index, right? It's but you can maybe extract something different out of there. And what that is, we don't know yet. And I think that's what the exercise is with Dora is, what supports a more diverse look at that information.
There's other metrics that can be used. Like we subscribe also to Clarivate Insights, and they have a number of metrics that aren't journal impact factor that are like open access, percent industry involvement, percent collaboration, as Andrew was talking about it. So there's a number of other metrics that maybe could be pulled into ORCID as well, not just, and I like using category normalized impact factor that kind of like normalizes it across a journal. But still that is relying on it. But there are different metrics that are out there that you don't have to hire an analyst, as you were saying, Michael, to do the calculation. You can maybe pull it into ORCID and use one of our 5 APIs.
And if I can add one thing is, Dora is really like using the record of publication against the researcher, right? Where I see a big benefit also is having access to those publications, where right now especially for social science and humanities, we have a really hard time linking that. So getting that 5 years after, so who you have their ORCID numbers, you can go back to and see what they've published, and then be able to look at how that's evolved and what the impact you had, doesn't go against anything DORA. It just helps telling your story as a funder and understanding the impact also of your programs and all sorts of stuff. So this is how we're looking at it and how the two can really come together and coexist with DORA also.
Good question. Ursula?
Great. Yeah, perfect. Okay, great. Thank you for that question, Gilda, and thank you also for all those great answers. I'm just gonna see if we have anyone else who has a question for our panelists today. I'm mindful that we're almost at 3 p.m. here, so we probably have time for one more question. And then, as I said, please send any follow-up questions to ORCID, to CRCan or Lyrasis staff. Michael, I see you have your hand up. Yeah, go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, hi. So to the other Michael, it's been a few years since NSERC has tried to track me down on with a Survey Monkey. It's been on my mind. I think one of the questions for both SSHRC and NSERC on the call, I guess, I mean, obviously, this whole discussion, I think, is coached in terms of there's very specific benefits to a funder, there's very specific benefits to a reviewer, there's very specific benefits to an applicant, and I think a lot of those narratives need to sort of be teased apart to really market it to the right groups. But what, like, do you, I feel like Diane and Andrew maybe more wholeheartedly endorsed this idea of like pushing funding data to an ORCID ID or pushing reviewer service to an ORCID ID. Is there a tri-agency stance on that yet?
Yeah, well, so like I said, I'll jump in real quick but we just joined in January, I believe, both of us joined. And we are looking at the use case. And yes, that is one of the use case that we are looking at. Like I said, though, earlier, we have lots of legacy systems and whatnot. So, we're looking at the feasibility of doing this and kind of in stages. So we don't grow, and maybe we will be able to do it all in one time. But the idea is to first collect the ID and some information, then be able to push some of that and some of the funding or awards back to them, and same thing with reviewer. So that is definitely in our radar and kind of like at the use case that we've identified. Now we're looking at what's the feasibility of doing this.
So we're less interested in pushing our reviewer identification out to ORCID or anywhere else. But one of the big benefits for us is actually in facilitating good discoverability and behavior when people acknowledge the awards. It turns out that although in our grant contracts we put a very explicit way in which they're supposed to cite the grant, it doesn't happen in the metadata effectively.
Yeah.
We're hoping that by pushing the data on our grants to ORCID, that metadata is improved, and so that we can follow outputs more cleanly. We can do it in a spotty fashion now in terms of which papers were explicitly published, which data sets were published, and that's the other thing is along the lines of less traditional metrics of assessing a grant. Things like data sets are far harder to track than a publication, and getting the metadata to link properly is really the key to that.
I'll end with one other point is that we're exploring, and not to get anyone's hopes up, but exploring minting DOIs for our grants through Crossref. So it's outside of ORCID, so apologies there. But we're doing it and we're exploring it from an OA open access angle, but obviously it has untold other benefits. So I'm hopeful that we can pursue that in parallel. And then wouldn't it be great if you could see both the grant information and also the DOI on an ORCID ID.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for that question, Michael, and thanks to our panelists for their great answers. So we are a little bit past the hour now. We'll be ending the community call for today, but I just wanted to highlight, as I mentioned before, and as Sheila posted in the chat, that any additional questions on this topic, please do reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you and help you and think about moving these topics forward from these great conversations we've had today. So I'd also like to really thank all of our panelists for being here today and taking time to participate in this discussion. And thank you to everyone who attended today and participated. We really appreciate it. And it was a really fascinating, stimulating conversation today. So thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Stay tuned for the recording, slides, and notes. Have a great day.
Au
Bye.
revoir.
Bye. Have a great